This is the train station on tncradio.live. We appreciate you tuning in to the show. I am Bill Waldrop along with my co-host Jim Leaders, and we had such a fascinating visit with Rollin Bredenberg on last week's show. We asked him back for this week's show to continue his stories of how he worked a very long career in the railroading industry and all that he went through and promoted through different railroads to different positions until his retirement. Rollin Bredenberg, welcome back to the show, sir. Thank you again for being with us.
It's great to be back with you.
Thank you, sir. On last week's show, we talked about your career working for the Southern Pacific, a lot of it with the meltdown here in the Houston area. But in March of 1994, you went to the Santa Fe Railway. How did you make the jump from Southern Pacific to the Santa Fe?
I guess the jump was made because the SP and Rollin were no longer a very good fit. Now that took a while to get there, but it happened going through the Anschutz purchase of SP. Phil had to do that because if the UP-WP merger stood and the Rio Grande was sitting out there without a viable Western railroad, and of course SP in those days did not want to take traffic to Ogden and Salt Lake. It just Anschutz, so the tail came along and bought the dog, and the folks on the Rio Grande started running the operation of SP kind of like they ran the Rio Grande Railroad. They figured they had enough expertise to do it. Some small lessons that were kind of emblematic of how they had to get used to a different kind of railroad was they thought that the ballast regulators that they used to clear snow in the Rockies would do just well on Donner Pass until they got covered up with snow and had to be bailed out with rotaries. It just in general, there was not a lot of respect given to the things that SP supervisors, leaders, and employees had learned many times the hard way about how the railroad needed to be run. Ed Moyers came along, and of course he was hired by Phil because he had done such a good job on the IC. We all know now that it was more Hunter Harrison telling Ed Moyers what to do that allowed him to do that. Ed himself was kind of exposed when he got over to the SP because once he got to the SP, people understood really quickly that he had no aptitude at all for trying to run a big operation like that. At that point in time, I was not willing to go to Denver. I knew what the implications of that would be. And I just said, I'll do whatever I can do to help bring value to this railroad, but I am not going to leave Houston. And I was invited to take a severance, and I took it. And that happened in November of 93. But in March of 94, I was in Schaumburg working for the Santa Fe as Assistant VP Intermodal Operations in Schaumburg. And of course, the guy that offered me the job was Rob Krebs, who had been in several iterations of my career, my boss at SP, starting with East St. Louis and going on to the point at which he left SP to go to work for Santa Fe when Santa Fe Southern Pacific Corporation was put together. The SP put into trust. Merger failed. SP had to be sold. Anschutz bought it. Rob stayed with Santa Fe, and I was at SP for several more years, but then ultimately left. And at the time I left, I did not think that I'd go back to work for a railroad again. And
was Rob president at the time of the Santa Fe when he asked you to come on board?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, he was CEO.
So you thought you would never, your railroad career was done at that point.
Right. As a matter of fact, I was at the time that he called me, I was a full-time firefighter and EMT, and sometime emergency dispatcher in Kingwood, Texas, and just having a ball doing stuff on my own and not having to worry about what everybody else was doing, but just being able to personally intervene between people and bad things happening to them, whether they be acute illnesses or their house on fire or an automobile accident. It was a very rewarding thing to do, and I was enjoying doing it. I'd been doing that as a volunteer for a while, but then started doing it on a paid basis when I left SP. Of course, I still hadn't figured out what I was going to do when the separation pay ran out. But for a while, I was possibly the most highly compensated firefighter in the state of Texas.
That's funny. And just a side note for you, I just retired after 32 years in law enforcement. I was with the Houston Police Department and worked as a supervisor in the dispatch center up there. So yeah, I have a long career in public service myself. So we have something in common.
Well, that's great. So anyway, my last shift in the Kingwood Fire Department was in February of 94. Went to work for the Santa Fe in March and ran the intermodal operation for about 18 months. It wasn't but about 3 months after I went to work for Santa Fe that Rob made the deal with Grinstein for BN to buy the Santa Fe. And I wound up in Fort Worth in September, as I recall, 95.
All right, so you're doing intermodal with Santa Fe and until the merger or the buyout.
Until the merger, and then once the merger happened, I came to Fort Worth and ran the operations center and ran it through the time that Schaumburg dispatcher's office was moved into Fort Worth, and then you had the network operations center in Fort Worth that you have now. After that, I ran the southern region, which was basically the old Santa Fe and the old Frisco. If you took those two franchises and put them together, that's what I was in charge of, running the southern region of the Santa Fe. Ran it until I went to being VP of Service Design and Performance. And I guess that happened in 99. And then I pretty much stayed doing that until the construction, the expansion needs of BNSF got to be so big that we started spending $900 billion a year on expansion. That happened starting in about 2011, I guess. So my last responsibilities at BNSF were VP of Capacity Planning and Operations Research.
And how much were they spending a year?
On expansion,
Right?
not on capital maintenance, not on locomotive capital, but just the expansion part of the capital.
And how much was that?
$900 to $1 billion a year.
Okay.
It takes a lot of money to run a railroad.
It takes a lot of money to be able to keep running enough trains for the free cash flow to be that high, but you got to stay in front of it. By that time, of course, we had double tracked the Transcon, all except the Emporia sub, which is being double tracked now. And we put in all of this double track in North Dakota for the Bakken boom that was going on back then, and just made big improvements in Southern California, Pacific Northwest, every place you can think of, these intermodal facilities all over the railroad. So it was an exciting job to have. But then finally, I retired a couple of months short of my 71st birthday, and that was in 2016.
Excellent.
When did Warren Buffett come in and make the famous call to Carl Ice and said, "Hey, how about $100 a share?" What year?
Oh, now this, see, because it was actually Matt at the time.
Oh, Matt Rose.
Yeah. And I'm going to say that was in 08. I think it was in 08.
Was that a big surprise to everybody in Fort Worth?
It was. But funny thing, my wife had said, she'd seen some articles about Warren Buffett being interested in railroads. She said, Buffett really ought to buy your railroad instead of Union Pacific. So one Friday afternoon, after everybody had gotten home, the leadership team, all of the VPs were paged, and we were told, be on a conference call at 7 p.m. Well, I wonder what this is all about. She said, well, it's probably for Matt to tell you that Warren Buffett's bought the company. I said, yeah, right.
That's funny. Yeah. And
that's what it was all about.
Fascinating. Let's take a break here, guys. This segment is done. We are visiting with Rollin Bredenberg here on the train station on tncradio.live. We can be reached via email for any questions or comments about the show. We are at houstonrailfans@gmail.com. I'm Bill Waldrop along with Jim Leaders. We'll be right back.
Kathy DeCaro is nothing short of amazing. She not only drives the world's biggest truck as a heavy equipment operator in northern Alberta, Canada. She's an international motivational speaker and the author of Dream Big, an autobiography about overcoming a lifetime of trauma and abuse that led to dreams of success. Kathy inspires people the world over to change their lives and improve their self-worth. Her book will change your life. She's passionate about personal growth and believes anyone can change their circumstances and overcome their obstacles if they believe in themselves. Her life will amaze you and seriously inspire you. Be sure to order a copy of her book, Dream Big, on Amazon.com.
Join Shelley Johnson and Kathy Tuccaro every Tuesday at 7 p.m. Central Time for Women Road Warriors on your driver navigation station, tncradio.live. Welcome back to the train station. This is tncradio.live. I'm Bill Waldrop with co-host Jim Leaders, and our guest again this week, who was so fascinating last week, we asked him back. His name is Rollin Bredenberg, had a long career in railroading, starting with the Southern Pacific on to the Santa Fe and to the BNSF Railway based out of Fort Worth. Rollin, now you retired in 2016 from the BNSF. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Was that your choice or their choice?
No, it was my choice. I was only a couple of months short of my 71st birthday when I retired.
Wow.
And as much as I love it, and I'd been at it for 52 years, there were parts of it that just get old for anybody. You really get tired of a lot of the meetings, a lot of the personnel management stuff. At least I did. There are parts of it that I'll never get tired of, but those are the parts that I keep dabbling in now as a consultant to various different places. But the thing about it is I get to pick and choose. I like to choose the things that I enjoy doing.
That sounds like another friend of ours who we interviewed on here, Steve Lee, who ran the Union Pacific Steam program. He retired from Union Pacific and went to work for the Wasatch Group out of Cheyenne. And he loves it because it's the same thing. He goes, I can pick and choose what I want to work on. If I don't want to, I don't do it. I'm not told by anybody. So he's in the same position. So you two have that in common.
Well, Steve, back when we first started this merged railroad, the first winter after the merger, we had this horrible blizzard that covered all of the upper Midwest. And we did not have enough snow fighting equipment to get through it and get all the railroad bailed out. And I called Steve and asked him if he was for hire. And he said, sure. We said, where do you want us? And so he started out on the Hettinger sub and cleaned out that whole railroad.
Where is that a part of, Rollin?
Well, that's part of the old Milwaukee that BN had.
So he brought his rotary out of Cheyenne.
Right, he brought his rotary out of Cheyenne and cleaned up that whole railroad that was under snow out there. It took him several days to do it, but that rotary of the UPs with him on it did a heck of a job getting the railroad open again. And so well, most people memories of Steve Lee are going to be about in the steam engine. Of course, I've ridden on the steam engine with Steve. My big memory is going to be how he volunteered his services, or at least agreed to go out at a premium price and clean up the railroad for us.
And I'm sure he didn't, crow about that at all, of how he bailed out the competition up there, and just friendly banter. But I'm sure he carried that a while.
Well, what other interesting people did you meet with on foreign railroads and dealt with?
Well, of course, there was Hunter Harrison.
Oh yes, Hunter.
And so there was this time when CN was going to combine with the BNSF, which is you may recall, the STB turned that down. And there was, after that happened in 2001, there wasn't any talk about Class 1 railroads merging for 20 years after that. Not until this CPKC thing came up. Well, he flew into Albuquerque and we brought him down to Belen, put him on a train, and we hauled him across the railroad from Belen up to Kansas City. And of course, you had to use a filter. You had to figure that, look, it's been a long time since people in any kind of a big business setting talk this way. But if you don't mind every sentence being laced with an F-bomb, you'll be all right. So all the way across, every time he'd see a UPS train, he'd see a 4 horsepower per ton, 4,000, 5,000 foot train on the hot days, because that's when we took him across there, was when the hot UPS trains were meeting each other out in the middle of the railroad. He told us exactly what was going to happen just as soon as he started running the place, that there weren't going to be any 4 horsepower per ton trains, and there weren't going to be any of these short trains. And he convinced us all that even though we really liked the place we worked, that if this really did take place and he were to take over, it wasn't going to be a fit place to be. And I'd already made peace with myself that as much as I liked BNSF, I was not going to go back in time 20 or 30 years and work around somebody who talked like that and who had as little regard to customer commitments as he did. He basically talked about how you do what you do the best, and you tell the customers that that's where they're going to have to fit in how you run the railroad. And you put locomotives in storage. You don't need all these locomotives. You don't need to be buying these locomotives. You don't need to be making all of these physical expansion improvements. And he was already picking out all of the low-hanging fruit. Now, he had not coined this precision schedule railroading thing at that point in time. It's a funny thing that every railroad where he was, whether CN, CP, CSX, ultimately, where he was, whatever railroad that was the least reliable connection you had. That was the connection you had that was always in the midst of turmoil. But yet the analysts were buying hook, line, and sinker this precision schedule railroading thing, which has a whole lot more to do with meat axes than it does with precision or schedule. And it is a top-down driven management style that does work very well for somebody like Ackman, who really doesn't care if the railroads are here for the long run or not.
Just the hedge funds.
Just right. So that was an interesting character. One of the things that I put together, some dots I put together after that was over with, was he told us on that trip how when Ed Moyers was running SP, how Ed called him a couple of times a day to get advice on stuff. Because
Oh my gosh, that's horrible.
Right. And of course, Hunter was running IC and CN at the time. And when we were putting the merger together, of course, at that point in time, I was in charge of service design and went to the CN's offices in the NBC building there in Chicago to work with them on service design. Hunter had an office there in Chicago, and he told me about all of the ways that he had guided Ed Moyers in how to run the SP. And of course, it all figured. Ed, of course, didn't last long at SP at all, but he did do what Phil wanted him to do at SP, and that was to raise the IPO stock price on the first IPO. And then, of course, when UP was left having to buy the SP after that, then of course, Phil made a killing on the equity he had in the public company because of the fact that UP was really forced to make it. UP didn't have a choice but to buy SP. So that was
that was the UP's only way out. They had to have that railroad.
They had to, right.
Right.
But I'll also tell you this, and that is UP is the only company, including Santa Fe, including BN, including any other company, that could have pulled off the merger of the two railroads. Yeah, yes, UP had their Houston meltdown in 97, and there's a whole lot of elements of that could have been avoided, probably. But the fact is that any other railroad that had tried to take on SP would not have succeeded because they did not have the cash muscle their way through it. And this was the only way that you come out with the SP franchise basically coming out as a whole, being part of the Union Pacific. It would have been in dozens of pieces had it not been for UP.
Hey guys, we got to take a break real quick on this segment. This is the train station on tncradio.live. I'm Bill Waldrop along with Jim Leaders. And our guest today was the same guest we had last week. He's so fascinating, we asked him back. His name is Rollin Bredenberg, and we'll continue with him in just a couple of minutes. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Dr. Christopher Cortman, and now for the Mental Health Minute. There was an excellent movie from years ago called City Slickers. Laughed a lot, enjoyed it very much. It featured some urban type guys taking a week's vacation, learning to be cowboys. And they showed them riding endlessly horseback and trying to figure out things to talk about. In one episode, they played a game called Worst Day, Best Day. And they shared with each other the worst day of their lives and what happened, and also the best day. One cowboy wannabe was talking about his childhood, and he described a scene where his mother and father were fighting yet again, and his father was aggressive with his mother. And the story he told is that he finally got up the nerve as a boy to get up in his father's face and say, "You get out of here." And he said, "My father left and he never came back." And there was a sense of quiet. And then finally someone changed the subject by saying, "Okay, best day." And he said, "Same day." Sometimes going through the worst thing in our lives gives us the opportunity to grow and turn things into the best ever. I have a patient now, a young lady who was in a car wreck while she was drinking and she hurt some people. And she's ashamed and she feels terribly about what she did. But she also knows that she has the opportunity now to become sober and to become the very best version of herself. All because she turned the worst day into the best day.
Be sure to listen to Building Strong Minds with Dr. Chris, Mondays at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central, right here on tncradio.live.
This is the train station on tncradio.live. I'm Bill Waldrop, along with Jim Leaders, my co-host. And our guest this week is Rollin Bredenberg, and we're talking about his very lengthy career in railroading, retired from the BNSF Railway, but is still involved in railroading in some aspects. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But Rollin, we were talking on the last segment about some interesting characters along your lengthy path in railroading. And one of them we know of is Phil Anschutz of the Southern Pacific Railroad. What will you admit to knowing about this guy?
Well, he's very sharp, financially interesting. He did the things he needed to monetize the value he could get out of Southern Pacific, to monetize, to really shore up DNRGW. Had he not done that, DNRGW by itself as a small railroad would have withered and died, because SP wouldn't have cared anything about it, neither did anybody to their east. So that was probably something he had to do. But once he got SP, the whole emphasis was making the perceived value of SP as high as he could get it, so that even though he didn't have a whole lot of his money in it, he could really leverage what was there. And so he did that. In the process, however, SP did not flourish. It is not Phil Anschutz's fault that SP went down the tubes the way it did. That all happened immediately following Donald Russell leaving SP and the term it had under Ben Biagini. But I don't really want to get into that, but about a whole lot of decisions were made in those years that pretty well shaped the options that SP would ultimately have in terms of surviving.
So you had a lot of mentors through the years that helped you along your way and through your extensive career and all that. And I'm guessing you've maybe passed on that knowledge to others. Have you taken, some people that you liked a lot under your wing and shown them the ropes and see them succeed in the railroading industry?
Well, yes. I don't want to get into that too personally. I'll tell you that one person I'm just awfully proud of is Paul Duncan, who took my job at BNSF, and he's had a whole lot more responsibilities added to him since. And I can really tell you that I think that at this point in time, he's doing a better job at that than I could be doing, because after all, your shelf life does expire, and he's 30 years or so younger than I am, and his passion for the industry, not just BNSF, but the things he knows about all the railroads and his passion for it are really helping BNSF at this point in time.
He sounds like another Rollin Bredenberg, by the way you describe him.
Well, that's what one of my colleagues told me when he first came to work for the railroad. He'd been working for the railroad for a year and a half or two, and Fritz said, "You got to meet this guy. He's another Rollin." Well,
perfect.
He turned out to be a whole lot more than that. So he's doing great. Just so you know, at this point in time, he has more responsibility than I did when I retired.
Wow.
That's a lot.
That's a lot. Anybody else? Any other interesting characters? I know there's so many.
Yeah. So there was this guy early in my career. His name was Rufus Dippery. And Clyde Carley wrote an article about him in I think it was an April 1958 edition of Trains Magazine. Now, as I told you earlier, that at that point in time, I'm like 13 years old. And I read that article sometime that year. And when I read that article, I decided that that's what I want to be. I want to be a train master. And I just read all of these fascinating stories coming out of this guy. Well, later on, I got to meet Dip, and then it all started making sense to me. Dip loved to just lay it on and lay it on thick. And of course, Clyde Carley was eating it all up when he was writing that article in Trains magazine. And he was talking about the floods in Central Texas and all of the things that were going on that actually had not a whole lot to do with Dip's rather mundane job as train master at Ennis, but he just reached out and grabbed a whole lot of stuff and started pulling it into that article. But at any rate, it did inspire me. And Dip was just an absolute character when it came to teaching people how to do what we used to call efficiency tests, which later became called operations tests. And people just loved to be around him because he'd leave the office and say, "We're going to test it." And he'd get a big old section of bologna and a big old block of cheese and a loaf of bread, and tell whoever was going with him, now we've got our meal, so we're not going to have to stop for lunch anywhere. If you want to eat anything, just cut you off a slice of bologna and a slice of cheese and put it between a couple of pieces of bread, and we're going to keep going. And that's what they did.
Impressive.
Now, he was a SP man, right?
He was an SP guy, right?
Right. Okay, guys, let's take another break here, and we'll finish up the program with our final segment here in just a moment. This is The Train Station on TNCRadio.live. Our guest today is Rollin Bredenberg. I am Bill Waldrop along with Jim Leaders. We'll be right back.
And so I go outside and I wash my face in the snow in the morning, and it wakes me up, and it definitely feels like winter out there, 25 below. I don't know, last year, I first time I froze 2 fingers on my right hand, that first knuckle, my fingers were black. No. if you've got 11 kids, I'll tell you, you don't have to talk about anything, just about them.
I'm Tom Kelly.
And I'm Shelley Johnson.
And we're here with you for a brand new show with Alex Debogorski. This is Taillights.
This is Alex Debogorski. Catch our new show, Taillights, Tuesday nights at 6 p.m. Central on TNCRadio.live.
Be sure to catch the Truckers Network radio show with your host, Shelley Johnson, weekdays at 3 p.m. Central, 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on TNCRadio.live. Welcome back to the Train Station on TNCRadio.live. Our guest this week is the same guest we had last week. He's so fascinating and so many great stories. We asked him back. His name is Rollin Bredenberg, retired from the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railway and is now doing independent consulting. We'll get to that in just a moment. Jim, you had a question for him about the Blue Streak. Well, what you got?
Well, Rollin, I know it was one of the hottest trains on the Cotton Belt, and had to leave East St. Louis on time every day, or else San Francisco would be calling. So tell us your experiences with the Blue Streak.
I guess the best experience I had with the Blue Streak, other than being able to ride it as a trainman from San Antonio to Del Rio, which was just really a hoot because we made that 171 miles in 2 hours and 30 minutes. And it was nothing but a great trip. But there was a whole lot more to it. I found out starting with when I was terminal superintendent in East St. Louis, and you had to get these interchange cuts from the Illinois Central Auto Parts cars and get these cars off the intermodal facility and cut them into the right block in the train. And it was the train was supposed to leave at 8, but it was really a whole lot better if it left between 7 and 7:30. And when I got to be terminal superintendent, actually before that, when I went up into the tower as a relief train master and was still running the intermodal facility, we started for the first time figuring out just exactly how many cars we were going to need for that night's BSM off the intermodal facility. And we'd air test those cars, and we put the brake shoes on them as BNSF cars. And so when it came time to run the train, all we had to do, we actually had the caboose on the intermodal track on the end of the train. That was back in the days of cabooses, you know. And so we'd double over the rear end of the train, and the train was already made up. There was no making up the train then once you pull the intermodal facility, because the train actually ran out of one of the intermodal tracks, having been doubled over from the other one. And so zip, there goes the train. And now the train was leaving at 6:30 instead of 7:30. And everybody really thought that was pretty cool stuff. Down at Pine Bluff, though, you had to get that train out of East St. Louis as early as you could, because I mentioned earlier, and I won't repeat all of that, but we had to take that train, split it up 3 ways, and cut cars into all 3 of them, and run one train to the LA intermodal facility, another basically auto parts train, and another train that had the El Pasos and the Tucsons and Phoenixes, City of Industries on it, and just run 3 trains, just bang, 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 as fast as you could get them out of there. When it got down onto the train order territory, when it got off the Cotton Belt and got out of CTC, they ran as first, second, and third number 46 from Corsicana down to Hearn, because that was an east to west railroad down there, with east being toward Houston. As soon as they made the turn at Hearn, they became first, second, and third 45 and ran as a scheduled train, first class scheduled train, all the way to El Paso. Those trains actually did get the railroad into some trouble with operating practices, cultural practices you came into, because the engineers knew that the ones that the higher ups loved were the ones that never lost time with the BSM. But if you never ever lost time with the BSM as a locomotive engineer, you probably were going faster than you should have been going.
And what was the speed limit in those days?
70
7
for him, for the BSM. And some of these guys did more than that. The scariest part was when the manual block rules were in effect between Hearn and Giddings, where there were no block segments. But under manual block rules, if there was no other train authorized in any direction on that part of the railroad, you could declare manual block rules in effect and run the train at 70 miles an hour in dark territory instead of 49 miles an hour.
Wow.
Well, anybody that had any sense was scared to death until they finally saw that first signal at Giddings and figured that they'd somehow or other cheated terrible travesty one more time, getting across the railroad at 70 miles an hour without ever having a signal to protect them.
Well, but we got a couple more minutes here. Let's kind of switch over here and wrap up our show. Like I said, you retired from BNSF in April of 2016, and now you're doing independent consulting in railroad operations, scheduling, and capacity planning. A lot of what you did with the different railroads. Are you doing it for the class ones or more like the small short line railroads? Kind of, who's your customer these days?
Okay, well, my customers are actually a couple of consulting companies. I have a couple of contracts with them for when they need a hired gun for some of the things that I'm best at. And basically, when they need a shortcut to things I already know the answer to, rather than having to take the long way around to figure some of these things out, especially like capacity planning and things like that. I've also had a lot of fun consulting with the Federal Railroad Administration on Amtrak metrics and standards. and on PTC interoperability among the railroads. That was all before PTC was fully installed on all of the railroads. And of course, the metrics and standards that I worked on were published in November of last year. So right now, I'm consulting regional railroads and the FRA and a couple of other matters that I really can't get into.
One last question from me, Rollin, is you think it's going to take another entire year like 2022 for the STB to come up with a decision on this CP-KCS merger, time-wise?
Time-wise, I expect it will.
So it's not going to be until late 2022 before we hear about this.
Well, I wouldn't expect it. I
Right.
think that's the way it's going to work out. I could be wrong.
Right. Now, and of course, TransCanada has to get in on this, along with the Department of Justice, and I'm sure several other agencies, not to count the squawking that's going to come from the UP or the different elements of trackage rights from the UP or the BNSF, because I'm sure they're going to scream loud and clearly to the STB.
Well, I believe that last week was the deadline for anybody who wanted to be party to the case to file. So by now, probably we know who is going to insist on being party to the case. Some people who want to be party to the case really don't have a dog in the hunt, but they just want something out of the case. And other people are legitimately in the case.
Right.
So as adversaries, so we'll see how that works out.
It's going to be an interesting decision, that's for sure.
All right, gentlemen, that's it. That is week 2 of our show. Thank you so much to Rollin Bredenberg, retired from BNSF, and before that, the Santa Fe and the Southern Pacific, a lengthy career. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us today. It's been absolutely fascinating. We hope you enjoyed it. And again, thank you for being with us.
Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you. Y'all have a great day. This is the train station on tncradio.live. I'm Bill Waldrop along with Jim Leaders. We can be contacted via email if you have any questions or comments about the show. We are at HoustonRailFans@gmail.com. Have a great day. We'll see you next week.